All right, perfect. We're live and recording.
All right, great. If we're all ready to go, and let's start this session. So, good evening, everyone, or afternoon or morning, depending on where you're tuning in from, and welcome to our panel. So, today we'll be discussing crunch in the games industry, and we'll be sharing our thoughts on how to effectively combat it. To the audience that's joining in, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section of the chat to the right-hand side, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the session. So let's start with a round of introductions. I'm Saumya. I've been around the games industry in India for about 15 years now, actually, in a variety of roles. And I'm now a producer for mobile games at Gear Inc. And I'll be a moderator this evening. And we have some incredibly esteemed panelists over here, all absolute stalwarts of the industry. So I think between all of you, you've probably seen everything and done everything. So why don't I let you all introduce yourselves? So tell us a bit about what you do, your background, or how and why you got into the industry. Why don't we start with you, Heather?
All right. Hello. Good evening. I'm Heather Hazen. I'm currently the COO at Firaxis Games. I've been making games for over 20 years. I started my career at Cartoon Network, actually, because I loved their shows and I loved their programming. And I was really excited to think about bringing an interactive experience to their audience. So I was there for several years. And then I moved to PopCap and worked on some of the original PopCap adaptations for Xbox Live or iPhone, including Plants vs. Zombies and Bejeweled. I ended up running, and Peggle, that was one of my favorites. And then I ended up running the live service organization there after PopCap was acquired by Electronic Arts. So I was at PopCap for almost 10 years. And then most recently was the executive producer of Fortnite with Epic Games, and just joined Firaxis as COO.
Amazing. That's absolutely wonderful. What about you, Akshay?
Hey, that was fascinating, Heather. Good to be on the same panel as you.
Oh, thank you.
So quickly, I think I'm going to be the newbie in this panel. I've been in gaming formally for about a year or so. Currently, I'm looking at a few games in Zynga, largely the farm games, looking at how we manage them globally. We're also building a new mass market, team out in Bangalore, looking to ship games worldwide. That's what I'm looking at currently. My background is around engineering, product, and business roles for the past 17 years or so, ranging from telecom to edtech to fintech, and now in gaming. My fascination with gaming has been trying to learn how user behavior is modeled overall, right? How we can actually positively impact behavior and use that for bringing in good change. That's what motivated me to look at gaming, and I've always seen gaming as the space where a lot of change starts, right? Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but I think it's in our control to make the best of it, and trying to learn largely and trying to positively use that in spaces where we can do more. Over my career, worked across a various set of cultures, Indian American, Chinese, Korean, some European as well. And I've seen different versions of what we're talking about today. So it'll be fascinating to see where this conversation goes.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think you've definitely joined the most fun industry. So welcome aboard, and it's good to have you here. What about you, Yogi? Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I've been part of this industry since last 16 years. So I started in the early days when there were not a lot of studios around. So I started with Paradox Games, which is right now Reliance Games. So that was kind of my breaking in movement in the industry. And then me and a couple of my friends moved to Nazara, where we set up their game studio. So I was into branded games, adware games, and cricket verticals. Then I moved to Gameloft, where I kind of worked on, you can name the entire or the whole range of devices, mobile devices that are there in the world. So right from the Blackberries to the Brew Java phones to mini PCs, DS, and then finally I moved to Jumpstart, where I started on console, uh, then moved to mobile, and then finally virtual worlds and MMOs. And I've also worked a lot of roles throughout my career: design, production. When I landed at Jumpstart, so I started as a producer, then as a lead producer, then finally country manager at Jumpstart. And now currently I'm working as an independent consultant in the virtual world and MMO space.
All right, amazing. And last but not least, Tejas, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hey guys, so I've been writing code and making games since I think about 7th, 8th grade. Of course, not professionally back then, but I always wanted to get into games, make games. Didn't look at any other alternate career. Stayed out of college, started doing that at a game company. People who met at a gaming competition. So lovely bunch of people. Like some of the people from the company were people who had made Doom and like not Doom, like not John Carmack, but who had worked on that game. But anyway, so I worked on handheld mobile games when the iPhone just came out. And then I wanted to work on real games because I was like a real gamer, right? As if other forms of games didn't exist. I moved to Germany to work on a AAA MMOFPS on the Unreal Engine. Spent a couple of years there, and then moved back to India. Moved to Electronic Arts, where we largely worked on mobile games. And also a lot of the transformation in my career and my mindset started happening, where we worked on social games and some games which at first we thought were shopping carts or like the whole games for like women and pet society, and that whole cultural shift happened. And then we realized that the whole thinking of like hardcore gamers is just like a very small group of people. But anyways, I mean, so I started as an individual contributor at EA. I grew from that role to be a technical director for a bunch of games over like I think 6 years there. In total, this whole like journey took about 14 years or 13 years, and then I basically decided to quit and go indie. While doing that, I've also been helping like run the production track in the IGDC. And like doing the whole indie thing. So I personally like what's more important, like the way I look at this panel is like there are very like pockets of perspective that comes into this panel, right? From like AAA to even like games for children or versus like games industry versus the other industry. But I've been a person who's like culturally very strongly believed in crunch not being something that's right, or like you should always be working towards eliminating it completely. Having said that, once I went in D, one of our goals was like, hey, we'll never crunch. But that did not, I mean, we weren't able to maintain that goal. We ended up crunching for good reasons, bad reasons. But there's like a new sort of understanding you get when you're in these positions of like running a studio or making decisions. So I'm sort of in the middle of like, I'll probably be representing the indie voice in this panel, but also the idealistic versus what is the practical aspects of like, hey, can you actually completely eliminate crunch or not? But yeah, that's me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think the diversity of perspectives is really what we're looking for on this panel. So I'm so glad to have you all here. So once again, for the audience, if you're joining us, if you have any questions, we try to get to as many of them as we can. Just post them in the Q&A panel on the discussion tab to your right. All right, so today we are going to be talking about crunch, which is more than a delicious chocolate bar or the sound cornflakes make in your mouth. We are, of course, referring to the practice of game developers having to put in long hours, excessively working weekends for extended periods of time just to hit release deadlines. So it's almost considered, I think, a facet of the industry at this point, isn't it? I mean, if you work in games, you have to crunch. It's almost expected. Which is also quite alarming when you think about it, because the very people who are effectively, bringing so much joy to the world through the games that they make, that we all love playing, they have to endure so much pressure just to do that. And most of us, I think, got into the industry because we love video games. It's more than just a job. It's a passion for us. But sometimes we find that the price we're paying is just a little bit too high. So I'd like to pose a question to our panelists. Why do you think this has happened? Why is the state of the industry this way? Is it something about the way the games industry has evolved over the decades. Is it a production or a planning problem? Is it a company or studio leadership's problem, for example? Is it inflated expectations or something else entirely? So I'd really like to hear from you folks. Why don't we start with you, Heather?
Well, I don't know what to say about how crunch we got to where we are in terms of, crunch being a part of our industry. I will say that I've experienced it myself. It's changed a lot over time for me because, as I started working, we had release to manufacture dates. We had dates that we actually had to deliver a build to someone to print on a disc, to go to manufacture to be delivered out to the world several months later. And, I think I can understand why that would create some kind of pressure because that date could not change because manufacturing times were what the manufacturing times were. As I've evolved into live service, that's no longer the case, especially when you're thinking about the amount of time that it takes to turn around a build. It could be, a couple of days. So there's no real time pressure in a live environment, other than, we want to land an event at a specific time or we want to release a content pack at a specific time. So from my perspective, I think it's really turned into something that is culturally a part of the way that we make games. And we have to, because it's there and because it probably started back when there was this, manufacturing deadline, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about new ways to approach, hitting deadlines or redefining processes to avoid it, because crunch is not a good thing for anyone. I've never seen people who are exhausted and working many hours in a row, delivering their best work or being creative.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I think we're all on the same page on crunch not being an ideal thing. What about you, Yogi? What are your thoughts on this?
So basically, when we started, so it was kind of a tenet that, no games can be built without any crunch. So crunch is technically unavoidable. So, and the so-called passion was used very passionately against us, that if you don't crunch, probably you don't care enough about the game. So should you be really here? And also there was this peer pressure where somebody else is crunching, some other people are putting in more time, then why are you not? Do you not care enough about the game? That is something that kind of is ingrained in our minds, that to build something better, you need to put in the extra effort, go that extra mile to achieve that kind of polish or something. That is something that we've kind of grown up as a part of the industry. But over the years, we've realized that is not sustainable. It is something that burns you out, and it's something that causes a lot of problems. So technically, from what I've seen throughout, primarily it can be eliminated or reduced by probably better planning. Also, some cases it's unavoidable because of the market conditions or some unexpected events that force you to do that. But again, that's not a solution. So you need to find a right medium where to mitigate that without burning out the team.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. What about your experience, Tejas? What do you think?
So, just in terms of experience, my very first experience was at my first job. We were doing a project for EA Partners for the Nintendo DS. And I spent about 7 or 8 days, I think, sleeping on the desk, maybe going back home for half an hour just to shower so I can come back because we didn't have a shower at the office. But honestly, back then I enjoyed it because I felt like I had a bunch of responsibility and accountability, and I felt like, oh, I was doing something really cool. Because hey, we're like talking. We went to Goa and like at a fancy 7-star resort the first time we met those guys, and it was awesome. Like, hey, we're working on this big opportunity, right? So I have to put my best effort so that we can get to like the first milestone and whatnot. But over time, again, like all of you have mentioned that, right? It's not sustainable. Over time, you realize it's not good, and once you have family and whatnot. But I think I was having, when I was thinking about this panel, I was having a philosophical sort of a brain thing. One thing that came to my mind is like of the question, like, no, ideally you can't answer that of how we came to this point of why crunch happens, but maybe there's like one single thing of like promises. Like it's a bit of a euphemism, but I think that crunch happens because of promises, like promises somebody has made to maybe themselves or somebody else. In some cases, it's actual like promises of like, hey, even if it's resources, I have this much money and I promise that we'll finish this game or make this enough money to keep surviving. Or like, hey, my manager or a publisher that, hey, okay, we'll finish this feature by this time. And now it's even users like, hey, okay, our users are expecting this feature to come out, or like a Christmas or Halloween special. So the way I think of it right now, it's all about promises. If you don't promise something, you can probably change your mind or like iterate. But the more like committed you are to a certain like a date or time or functionality, the more you push yourself to achieve that. And most of the time, the easiest way is to crunch, because sure, you can add people or throw money at the problem, but that sometimes makes the problem worse. So people just try to take the easier way out of just crunching more and trying to fulfill that promise. Or you can not fulfill it and feel like a wreck or like lose out on all the opportunity, money, or whatnot. But that's like one thing that I was thinking of. Maybe that's why crunch happens.
Right, right. Those are some really excellent points. And Akshay, what about you? Do you have anything to add?
Hey, Saumya, I think bad planning and like Heather mentioned, like setting expectations and against hard timelines is hard, right? A couple of different perspectives there is. I've seen this actually break in the way some company or team cultures are set up, and there's a certain amount of toxicity that gets built up over time, right? So if there are cultures that encourage and celebrate effort over impact, I think that's where we start to see some of these negative signs build up. I mean, without naming companies, like we've had cases where when folks leave for home at like 6 or 7 in the evening, it's treated as half a day at work, right? And I've heard this personally myself. And that's the kind of toxicity we want to avoid, right? We want to make sure that we celebrate impact. We don't care about how many hours you put in, right? But we care about how do we do it, and that's something that I think over time companies have realized that there are structures like OKRs that you can put up in place and clearly celebrate what the impact is. I think that has massively changed for me and had a positive impact for me and my teams. I think a couple of other minor things, but I think add up over time is just a lack of awareness of your personal awareness and your team as well, right? Like what skills do your team bring to the table? What's their maturity, experience level, and practically what can they shift, right? As a manager, as a leader, that's expected of you to understand and not be very simplistic about it, right? And I think that's where good planning goes a long way, to be realistic and set those expectations right. One other aspect that I feel when I see the examples of where it's broken, I see that there's always been a trust deficit, right? Like where employees or team members haven't been very open in sharing what their aspirations are, where they want to be, even if they have personal roadblocks in their life. And if these conversations are not healthy over time, it does lead to, unplanned attrition. It does lead to, teams being unavailable. All of those adds up over time. And very often we don't look at the root cause, right? The root cause is not having a healthy culture where you're open to sharing with trust. I think those were the three things I would think are also learnings from me and probably root causes of why this happened in my experience.
Right, right. That's very insightful. I think, it's such a complex confluence of factors. I think sometimes it's about a toxic work culture that doesn't value, the employee's time more than simply, treating them like a machine that needs to put out work. Sometimes it can be, impossible expectations or promises, as they just mentioned. And, sometimes it really is just the perennial condition of, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, as we say. And also, I think to an extent, it might be because of an audience expectation as well. For example, if you've set up the expectation, if you made a promise at E3 or something, it must be delivered no matter what the cost. And as an industry, I think, we're very hit driven, and because it's entertainment, there's always something new that draws our players away. So that sort of adds a bit of pressure as well. But I think that there are still a lot of big names in the industry who can sort of bank on their reputation a bit more and sort of avoid that. I think of Blizzard's philosophy of, it'll be ready when it's ready. And that works because fans trust them to deliver. So yeah, we've already touched on this a little bit, but I don't even think I need to ask, have you personally had any experiences with crunch, either as a leader or a team member? Can you share your war stories with us, and maybe a little bit about, how this impacted you, your teams, or studio morale? Why don't we start with you, Tejas?
So yeah, I mean, the first instance was that I've actually Germany was cool. Like we had a really good production process. Like tasks were estimated, although we didn't have a lot of ownership, but it went great. At EA, in different projects, I saw different levels of crunch. Some of it was good, most of it was bad. I don't know if there was ever a good crunch, but I've seen a fair bit of it. In our teams, we made a conscious effort. The more I got into leadership roles, we didn't really crunch, but I did see it in some teams where for a couple of months developers would be working sometimes late at night till like 10, 11, and somebody in the morning will come and ask, hey, why isn't that person here? It's already 10, 30, 11. Like, dude, that guy was working at 12 or 1 in the morning. Like, give them some time to like sleep. But largely a lot of it again was driven due to some milestones or some things, right? Decisions that were made. So I've seen bits and pieces of it, and I always like some of the other studios we worked with. I was like, we used to joke about it because we've seen crunch in other studios, but for them sometimes crunch was like, hey, you're staying back till 7:30 and 8, and we're crunching so hard, and we'd laugh it off because like, hey, that's not crunch. You're getting dinner and then you're just there till 7, and like that's fine. We're used to this. Like it's normal for us to be in office for 7. But then there were arguments like some people, I've heard some leadership say that, hey, these other studios, they're like much more professional. They'll come in on time, they'll do their work, they'll go back home. In India, we have a culture of you'll come in and like most, especially in the IT industries, they'll come, go for a tea break, then come back in, go for a smoke break, then come for lunch. So there are companies which are like very professional. Some studios are not, and then some leaders who come from different areas, they have this mentality of unless you give them like very unrealistic deadlines or targets, people won't really take it seriously, the work. So some of it is that as well. But largely, again, like it does come down to teams. Like most of the teams I worked with, we had a conscious thing of not crunching, and we managed to do it pretty much most of the time. But it took a lot of effort.
Right, right. What about you, Akshay? Why don't you share a bit of your, stories as well?
I think for me personally, I do agree with Tejas on when you're younger, fresh out of school or college, there is a certain amount of celebration in crunch, right? And that's where I think we get it wrong. And if we don't set the rules straight at that point, it tends to kind of reinforce bad habits, and it takes a while for us to correct, right? So I have a similar experience like that very early in my career, where I literally worked, 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. right for 3 or 4 months, trying to ship a product, thinking that at that point I felt that was it, right? Like if I worked for 3 months and I got this out, it was going to be all hunky dory after that, right? And you don't have really an aspiration to think long term and things like that at that point. It only got worse, right? Because I did not I literally slept 4 or 5 hours every day for 3 months, and it does take a toll, right? So it's not one. Of course, it's not healthy. But of course, I've personally learned from it to not repeat that ever again, and make sure that the setups we do for our teams also never happens again. Um, one was that, which was, I think, I would largely put that to ignorance and just being a little naive about it, right? Thinking that you can actually change the world in 3 months with whatever impact you could have. The other was at a fintech startup more closer home, where we were shipping stuff for the tax season, right? And we had a tax deadline, not related to gaming, but that was a government deadline, and you have to put your returns in by a certain date. And here is where I think we did a much better job. Like we essentially planned for, round the clock support, folks to be around, made sure that people came into office at times that were reasonable. If you had to stay till midnight, it meant you came in like late afternoon. And it was a crunch that was kind of planned, right? And it meant that we went into it, we being aggressive towards our goals. At the same time, you do feel the pressure, but you're not, spending excessive hours in office, right? And that also meant that we hired a lot of folks as contract workers for things that we needed much beforehand, and got through that experience a lot better. So I think two contrasting experiences. I do have a few more, but I'll let the others speak and then go over those later.
All right. Why don't we hear from you, Yogi?
Yeah, so I have many kind of experiences around crunch. So it's more like a story about how it happened. So we were shipping a title on Wii, so it was scheduled to be released sometime in Feb. But the push came from PR and marketing that we need to have something ready for Christmas, and we need to get it out by November, because the retailers and that point of time, the world was transitioning from a retail CD model to a digital download model. So we were rushed to ship the game 4 months early, and that too we were using an engine that was not very mature in its early days. So we were dealing with a lot of issues in terms of memory fragmentation, and just it was a mad rush trying to just get the game out. So even there was a lot of rush on getting the levels done. So it was more like a racing kart game. So the levels had to be built in a rush. The programmers were struggling to figure out the memory issues working with Wario World and the engine support, and it was kind of chaos. And even people were not convinced that, okay, fine, we are trying to get it out to the market, but at why? So it was kind of difficult to keep them motivated that, okay, this is something that is mandated by the market and we need to get it done. And also it was a consistent crunch for around 2.5 months. So it took its toll on people. One of the programmers quit midway through, then we had to find a replacement. And also at one point of time, the whole team was thinking that, okay, let's just get it out. Let's just ship the product. Forget about what is the real intention. So that kind of frustration crept into the team. And that too, we had a story around that when we submitted for the lot check, it was partially approved by NOA, that is Nintendo of America, but rejected by NOJ. So that also caused massive frustration among the team that why do we need to even submit to NOJ? But somehow we were able to pull it off and the project hit the shelves. So there I was involved in a personal capacity. So the major problems for me was keeping the team motivated and also kind of dealing with the crunch, and there were multiple things happening. So that point of time, there were also things like you had to deal with the publishing team, getting the manuals ready, getting the box art ready, and also managing the team. So it was utter chaos. So at that point of time, it kind of felt almost every day that, is this really worth it? Similarly, we had another situation much years later wherein for one of the products, the PR team wanted a demo to be ready for Comic-Con. So at that point of time, we had to rush in, and the team had to rush or crunch for more than a month and a half to get the demo out. And when the demo was out, so technically when you crunch, many times for a demo, a lot of things are hard-coded, or it's kind of a throwaway code or throwaway things. So that is something that caused a domino effect, that after the demo was done, many things had to be redone. And eventually, for the end, when the game had to be released, again, it needed another round of crunch to finish it. And it isn't healthy. So people kind of get frustrated.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I'm done.
No, I mean, I was just saying that so many of these stories are so familiar, I think, to all of us, every single one of us. Heather, do you have anything you'd like to share? I think you would probably have the most stories of all, even if you can't tell us details about the exact games or companies.
Yes, the sun is coming up, so apologies if you can't see me.
We can see you. It's okay.
Yeah. So I agree with Tejas and Akshay that early in my career, it didn't feel like crunch. We would call it crunch now, but my sort of identity was very wrapped up in the games that I was working on. And I felt so strongly that I wanted them to be amazing. I was passionate about what they turned out to be. And like specifically, I remember when we were working on Peggle for Xbox Live Arcade, we were designing a multiplayer mode, and I didn't want to go home. Like, I didn't feel that someone was asking me to stay. I felt so strongly that the game that I was working on was something that I wanted to play, that I wanted to give feedback on, that I wanted to evolve and innovate. And I was there until, midnight, many nights, but it felt like it was a part of who I was. And my team members were a part of my family because I didn't have a family. And so I think there's really something to that early on in your career. You feel like you're connected to the products that you're making. And I still feel like I'm connected to the products that I'm making. But the difference is I've gotten married, I have a child, and, I feel that being a well-rounded person that doesn't just focus on a specific thing like a game, and focuses on other things in my life, I actually can be more creative. And, there was a point in time when my son looked at me and said, "Mom, you never talk to me. You always have your face in your phone." And at that moment, I resolved to, never be that person again, because there's more to life than just making games.
Right. I think that's so important. Having that work-life balance is the most important thing of all. Like we were talking about, so many people come into this, with a sense of passion, and a sense of identity, working in the games industry, and that gets exploited a lot. And now I'd like to deal with, the question that I think we've all come to this panel to address. What's your advice on dealing with crunch? How can teams and studios avoid it or reduce it? And how can we as an industry, move towards more sustainable models of game development? If we had to take action now, what would that be? Why don't we hear from Yogi? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so for the main thing that I think in personally dealing with crunch is better planning. So because if you are planning for something that is a 6-month or a year-long thing, you can plan it better so that the crunch towards the end is not something that is needed as such if it's planned well. And sometimes also you need to empower your teams to make that decision whether what they can achieve in a time period. Now with us moving towards more of smaller games, live ops, smaller sprints, the teams themselves can decide what they can release in a particular time frame rather than having it mandated to them that this is something that you need to release or that this is something that needs to go in the game. Also things like feature creep, something that usually happens, that somebody needs to stop the feature creep because feature creep kind of tends to get into, okay, we need this feature so that to get this amount of polish. So to do that, it needs some amount of crunch to stop that. Is it really worth putting in that feature in the game to get to the point where you want to get to?
Right. I think proper planning is absolutely critical. And I think, Akshay, you had a lot of good points to make earlier about, leadership as well and work culture. Do you have any more, advice? What would you say to, game leaderships or studios that are battling crunch right now?
A lot to say, but I'll try to keep it short. And some of it, has been a work in progress for me, not still gotten there yet, right? I think that there are different perspectives I feel we need to look at here. One is the leadership, the other is, the middle management layer, like how do we empower them, enable them? And then there's the employee view. I'll just try to briefly cover all of those. One is, I think, from a leadership view, what we really need to understand is this hurts brand. This is not good for brand, right? You're not going to become a better place to work by actually supporting and empowering this way. So that is something that the leadership team needs to deeply understand. The second part, I think, which has been massively, like in the past few years, has made a massive difference to me is embracing the OKR culture, right? Like being supremely data driven in planning, right? In having like an 18 to 24-month view. If that's too long, at least a 12-month view. What needs to be done? Break it down to each of your teams and have them break it down to their teams, to the last individual, to know what will success mean for them this year, right? What are the specific things they want to do, and have a career development plan, have a plan built for them, with stretch goals also clearly indicated, which means that they know what areas to stretch at. And if there are things that come up beyond that, don't look at them, right? Because it's not good for us to move in a particular strategic direction, right? The other part which I strongly stay away from is to introduce artificial deadlines, right? Which is to say that we need this by a next date, right? And so many times these deadlines aren't real. These are not player facing. These are because somebody said so or somebody feels so, right? And those are not scalable. Right? And I think building a culture where we honestly ship when it's ready for the player, when it's ready for consumption, with enough testing and play tests and everything built in, is probably very important, right? A couple of other things I want to call out is training employees to say no. I think is important, right? Like empowering your team members to say it's okay to say no, right? It's okay to push back and say this is all I can do and there are reasons, and have a more rational conversation about it. And I set the boundaries for yourself and your manager and your leadership very cleanly. In terms of people, like having succession planning for key people in the team is critical from a leadership view, right? Knowing who's going to be taking up their roles in the future, having that in your mind and making sure the training paths for those are ready is also supremely helpful. And the last one, which I think is critical, is just to bias on results and impact and not on effort. I think that is the absolute number one thing. And if you're able to build a culture that leads towards that, I think that you'll have great outcomes come organically. And I do agree with some of the things Yogi spoke about in terms of feature creep, autonomy for teams to define their own goals, and of course, being player first in all of this.
Right. Absolutely agreed. I think one of the key factors is leadership, having the right perspective, the right approach, and keeping firmly in mind that burning the candle at both ends is not a good option, that it must be a last resort. What about you, Heather? Would you agree with that?
Oh, I totally agree with that. I think, something that Akshay said earlier really sort of put a pin on what I believe in terms of trust that you have to build with your team, because, it might surprise you as a producer for me to say that I actually think part of the solution is less planning, not more, which might fly in the face of what everyone has said. But I think if you can empower your team, but in order to empower them, they have to have full context on what you're working on. They have to understand why you're working on it, what the expectations are, not just we need to ship it, but it needs to perform this way from a business perspective. It needs to deliver this type of engagement for our audience. It needs to move our game forward in a meaningful whatever KPI you want to put in there. And once the team has that context, then they're capable of understanding what is important and why it's important. And so at that moment, you don't have to assign minute tasks to every person. You can actually say the most important things that we do are X, Y, and Z because of A, B, and C. And at that moment, that empowers the team to make smart decisions about where they put their work effort. Because Akshay is right. It's not about, how much time you spend. It's about the impact. And so if you don't understand the broader impact of the project, and you don't understand how to put your time and energy into those things, you're inevitably going to be wasting time, which then leads to, a crunch culture, because you haven't put the focus on the things that you most care about. And so my point of view is once people understand what they can do and why they need to do that thing, then if they clearly have a construct to choose those top initiatives, they're going to do them, and they're going to be more empowered and feel more innovative and more creative to bring their own passion, and the work will go faster. So, I'm not saying don't plan. So anybody on this panel, certainly don't take that away. But I think it's how do you plan in a way that ultimately gives people the ability to self-select into the work that they're passionate about in a time frame that, allows you also to say, all this stuff below this line doesn't matter, because we've got to ship this game.
Right. I think autonomy is such an excellent point, because that enables your team to make smart decisions and work smart, not hard, to achieve the goals that we need. Tejas, what do you think? What would you advise as a developer, as someone who's been through the crunch, I think, more than anybody else?
I think I'm in a very bad position after speaking after Akshay and Heather, because they've very succinctly put really good points forward. But thinking about these things, it's pretty much that. And in my head, it's more practical. It's exactly these things. But if you're I was looking at the question and answers section as well, right? If you're a developer and whose team is crunching, we'll get to that. But if you're a developer whose team is crunching, right? So how do you distill all of these things? Because what Akshay is talking about, what Heather is talking about, that's what being a good leader is, or in agile term, being a good product owner is, right? You're transparent. You're showing what your priorities are, helping the team plan better. The first thing, at least I've seen in a lot of Indian companies, is getting better, but nobody actually understands the whole process of agile development or people over process and all that. First step would be to get your team to actually start doing that. Start breaking down your work. The first thing about KPIs, right? If you're making very large goals, there's no way you're going to be able to even estimate or drive to that. Break everything down into as small chunks as possible that you can do in a few hours, a half a day, one day, then go from there into grouping of 2 days, 3 days, week, month, whatnot. But break it down so you can actually plan around that and start doing proper agiles or with plannings or hey, priorities, clear understanding of why you're doing things, what you're doing. So at least the initial problems I've seen in the Indian studios, a lot of it does improve by a lot when you break things down and make it easy to concentrate on, just focus on small things at a time. Because not everybody has the whole understanding of taking everything in one go, right? And understanding the impacts of every decision that you're making or change that you're making, how if one thing breaks, it affects the overall schedule. Old times where, hey, one bug that you left led to the discs not being burned or whatnot. Just eliminate all of that thinking or eliminate that risk of people being able to make mistakes by defining the work so well. But for maybe a brief minute, I'd actually probably want to throw the question back to Heather, because a lot of this actually works when you're a small team or you're a small product, right? Something you probably experienced with maybe Fortnite. I don't know if this works when you're wildly successful more than you imagine, and then you suddenly have to scale to a large team and build hundreds of features. How do you even manage things at that point of time? Because you're successful, you're growing, people want you to do a lot of things. So there's immense pressure, I'd imagine. What do you do in that scenario?
Well, you might be surprised to know that it is actually more important in a larger team, because, there was, as executive producer, there was no way that I could understand what every person was doing, nor is that my job. And so, being in a position to spend every moment of my day thinking about how to communicate to the team about what we're doing, what's working, and why, and something that might not be working, so this is where the leadership piece comes in that it has to be even more free and autonomous and self-directed in that moment, because it is so big. But if the leadership is not focused on communicating what you're trying to accomplish and what the goals are, and hyper focused on how the product is performing with the players. What are we hearing from our community every day? What are we hearing from player support? What is QA telling us? What are the major things that we need to address? And how do I tell the team about those things in a clear and consistent way? So in that case, it was less about planning, even more, because how do you plan a team of 150 people? It's more about making sure that the leaders on the team and the individual contributors on the team know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that takes a lot of energy. And so I think leadership sometimes gets distracted by all of the details that they're, kind of trying to juggle, and they get more focused, as opposed to taking a step back and saying, I need to communicate more clearly about this product than I've ever done before in my career.
Right. That's really great. Thank you for sharing. I think I liked Tejas's point as well about setting incremental goals that the team can reach one by one, because setting a challenge and meeting it, I think it is very empowering as well. And I think it makes me think that is the fundamental crux of games as well. Setting goals and then meeting them. So great. We are actually very far, we're very short on time, much farther, much sooner than I had anticipated. So why don't we move to some questions from the audience? So just taking a look at the panel. Well, this is very interesting. In countries like India, where we don't have concepts like paid overtime, how do developers and employees get fairly compensated for inevitable crunch? I think this is an excellent question. Sometimes, we have this thought that, when there's very strict labor laws, for example, or, overtime pay, it sort of, it impacts the business negatively. But, what would you folks say to that? Who would like to take that question? Anyone? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think India, unfortunately, is crippled by poor labor laws, not really outlining what's good and bad from a work culture view. But things are changing, right? Like there are outlets for employees first to clearly lay out that this is the culture of a place and discourage, new employees joining in. That's from the perspective of setting the rules straight. And I'm speaking from an employer view. A lot of the employers do this because they think they can get away with it. The first thing we should do is encourage the spirit of calling out, right? I mean, Twitter has been a great platform, right? The first thing we should be is calling out aggressively to say that this is something that's not acceptable, and ensuring that we pull up good examples of what this should look like, right? And there's umpteen examples of how things are done the right way. And I think those conversations should begin. Like, I think it's obviously wrong. Like, it's not one of those where there is a middle path. Not compensating is obviously incorrect, right? It's not. I would just say it in my thing. It's a binary answer. Like it's like fighting for basic rights, and needs to be done aggressively, and just it has to be done. Like in my book, right? And just like you would fight for what you think is a fundamental right, maybe what we lack, as a slightly younger workforce, is the awareness that it's a big issue, right? I think there are platforms to make sure now that voice is heard, and if needed, like I'm happy to support it too.
Yeah, that's incredible to hear. And, I also think about countries where there are strong labor laws, such as, Sweden. We have Supercell, which is one of the most, incredibly successful companies in games right now. In France, we have Ubisoft and Arcane, and in Germany as well is a pretty great, center for development. So it absolutely isn't the case that you need to burn your employees out without consequence in order to make, amazing games and have success. So we have another question here. Aren't developers part of the problem themselves? Like we already mentioned, we love what we do, so we want it to be just that bit better, just that more polished. But for regular software development, people draw the lines pretty quickly. So essentially, the question is, how can, I think the fundamental question is, how can we empower developers or empower the game makers themselves, people who are maybe not in a position of, corporate power in their companies? How can we empower them to change their working conditions a little bit better and stand up for themselves? Would anyone like to take that?
I'd like to take a stab at this, because I also think the person is also talking about overtime, like it creating a culture of like if one person is crunching, everybody starts. It's an expectation that everybody has to crunch. There's like, I think this is like not necessarily only a game development or a game industry thing, right? It's more of an organizational thing. You're part of the team. If you're, you also can influence the culture. So if you're doing better work or talk about these things with your team, talk about with your manager, the management and whatnot. If maybe it's only a team issue, then it's fine, right? You can move around. If it's a large company, if it's a small company, maybe people are not doing something intentionally. So it'll get better with time, or you will make improvements because everybody is responsible for improving the culture. And if it's a systematic issue or if it's a company issue, it's a cultural issue where No matter what you say, they're just like, they know that it's a problem, but they don't want to do anything about it. They're systematically supporting crunch. Quit your job. I mean, go find a better place to work at where they value like improvements. Like, it's not about only your opinion, right? But if you've made a rational argument or you actually care and you're trying to improve the system, it's not necessarily, people won't look at you just like, hey, you're like you're trying to be an outlier or you're trying to just be a Rambo. It happens. Like, there are companies which are good, there are companies which don't want to improve. Find a studio that's good for you. And where you can, don't give up. Like, don't just stop. Like, if it's just a team thing, maybe you love the company but just the team isn't working for you, work in a different team, try and work on a different project. But when it's like not a team issue, it's not a like a project issue, it's a company or it's a systematic issue, just move on. I mean, there's not much you can do at that point of time.
Saumya, can I add something here?
Yes, please go ahead, Heather.
Okay, so one thing that I think is really important to remember is that we make entertainment for a living, right? And so it's natural for us to all feel very connected to that because it is such a visceral experience. And so, wanting to add one last thing or add a bit of polish or any of that, I think is part of the challenge that we have in the medium in which we work. But I think every time, I think about this myself, every time I make a decision, it has a downstream impact. Every time someone decides that they're going to check code in at the 11th hour, you're pushing that problem down the chain to someone else, right? You've got QA that's got to now take a look at it. You've got someone that's now got to play test it. You've got to inform your community that it's, something that's possibly going to break because it happened at the very last minute. And so I always tell developers, like, I know that you're passionate, but think about the downstream impact of that last little change, because now it creates a chain reaction of people that need to pay attention to it. So that's thing one, like, always consider your teammates, because it's not just your change, it impacts the entire team. And thing two is setting boundaries yourself. I think, we are all capable of saying, I cannot do that today. I cannot do that this weekend. I cannot work at 7 p.m. because I have a commitment in my personal life. And I think a lot of times people are afraid to say those things for whatever reason, whatever cultural reason at that studio exists. But I think, I implore all of you to find your courage and set your own boundaries.
Right. Absolutely true. Absolutely essential. And what can we do to stop glamorizing crunch in the industry, especially for younger developers who feel like time is the most valuable thing they can contribute? So what do you folks have to say to that? Tejas? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Who wanted to take that?
Yeah, who's taking that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say it's hard. Like, it's like you're young, right? I mean, a lot of the thing Heather mentioned about taking up, like, starting to have a voice and starting to say no, that comes with time and maturity. And when you actually understand that, hey, you're not just another like somebody with like big blue eyes and like, hey, yo, game industry, I finally got a job. It comes with time, but it's really hard because like everybody who's coming in you, the game industry thrives on passion, and you do want passionate people. So it's a very hard problem because on one side you want people who are very excited and interested. The only thing is like having good mentors, maybe having people in the industry who know what like the going down this path could lead to, or where people could burn out or like just leave the industry itself, right? For a long time in my career, everybody who started with me, we'd have this thing where like, hey, if you cross the 5-year mark and you're still in the industry, that's like an achievement. Like, you'll actually survive. Otherwise, a lot of people look at like the conditions or like the pay and whatnot, and then a lot of people are not so passionate about games, or when they actually see how games are made or how much work they get to do in it, they're like, okay, yeah, this is fine, I've experienced it, and then they move on to a different industry. So having good mentors, like mentoring these newcomers and helping them pace their also enthusiasm and channeling it into good productivity, I think that can be a really powerful thing. So maybe that's something that can be done, but you can't really like just, I mean, because that's where it starts, right? The spark. So you can't like outright kill it. Rather just channel it into a productive means or system.
Hello.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, Heather, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think challenging convention is another thing that our younger generation of game makers can do, because let's face it, a lot of our processes and a lot of our, historical knowledge about how to make games is, many years old at this point. And so I think there's an opportunity for us as leaders to listen to some of these ideas that this new generation of game makers have to help us figure out how to address this. So, to all of you young people out there, talk to us. Tell us what you believe in. Tell us how we can address this problem, through fresh eyes, because I've been making games for over 20 years and I've learned and I've tried to listen, but at the same time, that's not like coming into a new project or a new industry with a fresh point of view.
Akshay, you had something as well.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Something similar. So I feel like how culture gets built is how the micro patterns get rewarded, right? Like, for instance, if I send like a note at 12 in the night saying, here's something I shipped and it's really cool, it's a time for somebody to point out, like, that it's not a behavior that you kind of reinforce, right? It's important, like in our teams, we encourage them to turn off, Slack notifications post their work hours, right? Not really attend to office stuff formally. And some of these apps do tend to, they're not built for that, but they do tend to encourage, quote unquote, bad behaviors. So I feel like as leaders and as managers, if we are able to identify patterns and encourage and reward the right patterns, I think people do learn looking at each other and learning from how each other behave a lot more than what we go out and say, right? So it's important how we encourage and set up systems, just like we do in our games, right? The metas we set up in our games to make sure people behave in a certain way. I think we should use those learnings within our own teams and make sure that they behave the right way, right? And even like when you're asking a question, are you asking somebody the question on Saturday night versus a Monday afternoon makes a lot of difference, because you're seeding a conversation which could have easily waited a couple of days. I feel those are, probably micro patterns, but are very important in seeding the right culture in teams.
Right. Absolutely agreed. There's one more question that says, what is your stance on unionization of game developers? I think that's quite a hot button topic right now.
Really a fun one. I mean, I expected this talk to be very, a bit more conflicty and people should have. But yeah, I think this is a perfect question for this session. So we should actually do a quick fire one, maybe. Starting from the bottom, I guess, from my screen, Akshay. I'm going to go last.
All right, Akshay.
I mean, I think I've been talking a lot, so I'll probably wait on this one and then go in last. Yogi, do you want to go? And
yeah. So in a way, what I think is Crunch is kind of a tool that is something that is the ultimate disaster management tool. So it can be effective in short bursts. So it's something like an afterburner. Like you use it for a short time to catch up on or achieve that amount of polish or achieve certain goals that you wanted to achieve. But in the long run, it's not sustainable and it doesn't help you in any way. For bigger players, it is definitely no, but for some small players, it can be a tool to save the company or achieve something that would help them build something that is a genre defining thing, or that additional amount of polish or additional amount of features that would help them stand out in the industry.
Sorry to cut you off, man. So I think the question was do you support unionization? What are your thoughts on that? If unionization would work or not, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Let's do a quick fire round because we're running out of time. So do you support unionization? What do you think? One liner.
Yes.
Okay. Heather.
I certainly support groups of people that support one another. I think that's the whole point of unions, is that your rights as a worker are represented. And if we can find a way for unionization to work in that context, where it doesn't become a power struggle and it becomes more of a constructive conversation, then yes, I would support it.
Okay. My view, I think I love the idea of unionization. It would be great if we can have like a good structure. Everything hearing both sides of the argument, I belief in humanity is very low. So I think the unions usually devolve and like they end up being their own beasts. So if we can find an actual good union, then I'm all for unionization. But being a business owner, it scares me. So I'm there at that stage right now.
I'd say
Akshay.
the quick one is I'd probably go with the word community more than union because I think we want to have positive impact. I think if I'm reading between the lines of the aspiration, it's to make sure that the governments treat us right, that we get the laws in place, and the organizations treat us right, right? And there are positive, communities across the world who've made this, right? Like we've had like LGBTQ, we've had women's rights, we have all of that being addressed by communities with sustained efforts, right, over different periods. And India itself is a great example. And I think there are movements and rebellions to learn from where, unions in a very political sense haven't been very fruitful. But if we were to construct this in a more positive manner, like I don't see a reason why we should not.
All right, absolutely wonderful and completely agreed. And with that, I think that is our time. So thank you all so much for joining us today, to our panels and to our audience. It was really invigorating discussion, I think. I think we're all agreed that crunch, while sometimes unavoidable, is absolutely unsustainable. And I think the conversation is very important to have about how we can start moving the needle towards the better. And I'm really glad that we're able to contribute just a little bit towards that as well. So with that, let's end the session. Thank you all so much again. It was absolutely wonderful talking with you all. And thank you to the audience for your questions.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. I can just now go and put on my LinkedIn that I was in panel with Heather once in my life, so it's like an achievement.
Thank you all.
Right. Thank you, guys. It was a fun session.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye bye. Have a good day.
Bye.